In 1941, the German panzers were not the Red Army's deadliest enemy. Neither was the Luftwaffe, raining death from above. Neither was the legendary Russian winter, freezing men and machines alike. The real killer, the enemy that brought the Red Army to its knees, was mud. Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. Twice a year, in spring and autumn, when snow melts or rains come, the vast expanses of Eastern Europe transform into an ocean of liquid earth. Roads vanish. Fields become swamps. Movement becomes impossible. Picture this scene, repeated thousands of times across the Eastern Front in late 1941. A Soviet ZIS-5 truck, a crude, outdated copy of an old Ford design, sunk to its axles in thick black mud, its engine smoking, its wheels spinning uselessly. Behind it, a horse, whipped to exhaustion trying to pull it free, has collapsed and died in the traces. This was the Red Army's supply chain, and it was broken. We have a romantic image of the Red Army in World War II. We think of T-34 tanks advancing in unstoppable waves. We think of mechanized warfare, modern warfare. This image is wrong. In 1941, the Red Army was not a modern army. It was, in most respects, a 19th century army with some 20th century weapons scattered throughout. The numbers tell the story. Over 3.5 million horses in Soviet military service. 3.5 million. The artillery, the legendary Soviet artillery that would eventually crush the Wehrmacht, was horse-drawn. 6 horses to pull a 76mm gun, 12 horses for a 122mm howitzer, 20 or more for the heavy 152mm guns. Supplies? Horse-drawn wagons. Fodder for the horses. More horse-drawn wagons. Infantry? They walked, marched, froze, starved. And when they couldn't march anymore, they died. Compare this to the German army. Yes, the Wehrmacht also used horses, millions of them, but their spearhead formations, the panzer divisions and motorized infantry, were fully mechanized. They had trucks, thousands of trucks. Opel Blitz, Mercedes-Benz. Captured French vehicles. The German Blitzkrieg wasn't just about tank superiority, it was about mobility, about truck superiority. In the summer of 1941, German mechanized columns were advancing 50 kilometers a day, sometimes more. The Soviets? They couldn't even retreat 10 kilometers a day because they were walking or riding on horse-drawn carts or simply stuck in the mud. By October 1941, the Rasputitsa arrived. The autumn rains. It stopped the German advance toward Moscow. Panzer divisions that had been racing across dry summer ground suddenly found themselves mired, immobile, waiting for the earth to freeze solid again. But if the Rasputitsa slowed the Germans, it annihilated the Soviets. The Red Army couldn't supply its cities under siege. Leningrad, surrounded, was starving. Over 1 million civilians would die. They couldn't reinforce their defensive lines. Units were cut off, isolated, destroyed piecemeal because no supplies could reach them. They couldn't move their artillery. Guns that were desperately needed at the front sat abandoned by the roadside because the horses were dead and no vehicle could traverse the mud. Stalin's high command was not just stunned. They were desperate, bordering on panic. They had factories in the Urals churning out T-34 tanks, the best tank in the world at that moment, but they had no fuel to put in them. They had no way to transport that fuel across hundreds of miles of impassable roads. They had millions of men under arms, but no food for them. No ammunition, no boots, no winter clothing. The war was being lost. Not because of German tactical brilliance, not because of superior weapons, because of mud, and because the Red Army was trying to fight a mechanized war with horses and broken-down trucks from the 1930s. On March 11th, 1941, 3 months before Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the United States Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it making America the arsenal of democracy. The idea was simple: lend or lease military equipment to any nation whose defense was vital to the United States. Initially, this meant Britain. But after Barbarossa, after it became clear that the Soviet Union would either survive or fall, and if it fell, Britain would stand alone, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to Stalin. The Soviet shopping list was predictable. They wanted tanks. They wanted aircraft. They wanted aluminum to build more aircraft. They wanted weapons. Roosevelt sent them all of those things, but he also sent them something Stalin hadn't asked for, something Stalin didn't think he needed, something the Soviet military leadership initially viewed with confusion, even annoyance. He sent them trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks. The Soviets were confused. Stalin wanted weapons to fight Germans. Roosevelt was sending him logistics. Roosevelt understood something Stalin, in his desperation, had not yet grasped. You can't win a modern war with horses. You can have the best tanks in the world. But if you can't fuel them, supply them, support them, they're useless. Mobility was the weapon. Trucks were the weapon. The Americans were going to teach the Soviets how to fight a mechanized war. But there was a massive logistical problem. How do you get 400,000 trucks from the United States to the Soviet Union? The most direct route was the Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. British and American ships, loaded with supplies, would sail around Norway into the Barents Sea. This route was a nightmare. German U-boats and aircraft based in Norway hunted the convoys relentlessly. Ships were sunk by the dozens, thousands of tons of supplies sent to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Sailors freezing to death in minutes in the icy water. There had to be another way. The answer was the Persian Corridor, and it was an engineering marvel that had been almost completely forgotten by history. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces jointly invaded neutral Iran. The reason? Iran's Shah was sympathetic to the Nazis, and the Allies needed Iran's oil fields and, more critically, its geography. Iran shared a border with the Soviet Union. If you could get supplies to Iran, you could drive them north into Soviet territory. The Americans took over. Thousands of U.S. Army engineers, the Persian Gulf Command, landed in Iran. Their mission: build a supply line from nothing. They built ports. The port of Khorramshahr on the Persian Gulf was expanded from a sleepy backwater into a major cargo hub. Ships arrived daily, carrying crated trucks, aircraft parts, ammunition, food. They built roads, improved the existing roads through the mountains, built new ones where none existed. They expanded the Trans-Iranian Railway, an engineering feat in itself, a railway that climbed through mountain passes, through tunnels, across bridges spanning gorges. And most remarkably, they built truck assembly plants. In the middle of the Iranian desert, trucks arrived from America in crates. Studebakers, primarily. They were unloaded, assembled by American and Iranian workers, fueled up, and then driven north. Through the mountains, through passes 8,000 feet above sea level, across deserts, through snowstorms, all the way to the Soviet border, where Soviet drivers took over and drove them the rest of the way to the front lines. It was an astonishing logistical achievement. By 1943, the Persian corridor was delivering more tonnage to the Soviet Union than the dangerous Murmansk convoys. And at the heart of this supply line was one vehicle, the Studebaker US6. The truck that arrived in the Soviet Union by the hundreds of thousands was the Studebaker US6. The Soviets called it the Studer. American crews called it the Studi. It looked unremarkable. A boxy, utilitarian truck, wooden cargo bed, canvas cover, no frills, no elegance. But to Soviet commanders seeing it for the first time, it was a revelation. Why? First, the magic of 6x6 Soviet trucks, the ZIS-5, the GAZAA, were 4x2 designs. 2 axles, rear-wheel drive only. In mud, in snow, on unpaved roads, they were useless. The rear wheels would spin. The truck would sink. It would need to be towed out by horses or tractors, assuming any were available. The Studebaker US6 was a 6x6. 3 axles, 6 wheels, all-wheel drive. This is difficult to overstate how revolutionary this was for the Red Army. The Studebaker could drive on mud. Not perfectly, no vehicle could, but it could maintain traction where Soviet trucks simply stopped. It floated on soft ground that had buried entire Soviet supply columns. Soviet officers who had spent years dealing with the nightmare of Rasputitsa logistics watched American trucks drive through mud that had been impassable. They were stunned. Second, the engine. The Studebaker was powered by a Hercules JXD inline-6 engine, 87 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much by modern standards, but it was powerful for a truck of that era. More importantly, it was reliable. Soviet engines of the period were notorious for breaking down. Quality control was poor, metallurgy was inconsistent, mechanics were undertrained. The Hercules engine, built in America with American quality standards, just worked. It started in -40°C Russian winters. It ran on low-quality Soviet gasoline. It kept running even when maintenance was minimal. Third, the design philosophy. The Studebaker US6 was not the U.S. Army's main truck. That was the GMC CCKW, the famous deuce and a half. The GMC was more sophisticated, more refined. The Studebaker was specifically designed for Lend-Lease, for export, for use by Allied armies with less training, less maintenance infrastructure, fewer mechanics. It was designed to be simple, rugged, easy to repair. You could fix many problems with a hammer, a wrench, and some wire. In the field, in a snowstorm, by a half-frozen, poorly trained 18-year-old conscript who'd been a farmer 6 months earlier. It was perfect for the Red Army's needs. The Soviet command wasn't just impressed, they were saved. The first, most obvious use of the Studebaker was exactly what Roosevelt intended: logistics. Moving supplies, moving men, moving ammunition. But the Soviets quickly realized the truck could do more. The Red Army was, at its core, an artillery army. Soviet doctrine was built around artillery. Massed artillery barrages that would pulverize German positions before the infantry and tanks attacked. The problem: Soviet artillery was horse-drawn. It was slow. It couldn't keep up with advancing tank formations. It couldn't exploit breakthroughs. The Studebaker changed that. Soviet gunners began using Studebakers as prime movers, trucks that towed artillery pieces. A ZIS-3 76mm field gun, the workhorse of Soviet artillery, could be hooked to a Studebaker and towed at 40 miles per hour on roads. Off-road, even in mud, the 6x6 could maintain 15 to 20 miles per hour. Suddenly, Soviet artillery was mobile. It could keep pace with the T-34 tanks. When the tanks broke through German lines, the artillery could follow immediately, providing fire support, suppressing German counterattacks. The 100 Katyusha 22mm howitzers, the 152mm heavy guns, all of them were now motorized. The Red Army was transforming from a slow, plodding force into something genuinely mechanized. But the Studebaker's true destiny, its iconic role, was as something else entirely. A weapon of terror. The Soviets had developed the BM-13 rocket launcher in 1939. Multiple rocket launcher. 16 rockets, mounted on rails on the back of a truck. Fire them all in quick succession, a rippling salvo that would blanket a target area with high explosives. The Germans called it Stalin's organ because of the distinctive howling sound the rockets made in flight. The Soviets called it Katyusha, Little Katy, after a popular wartime song. It was psychologically devastating. The sound alone was terrifying. The actual effect, 16 rockets landing in a concentrated area within seconds, was apocalyptic. But there was a problem. The original BM-13 was mounted on Soviet ZIS-6 truck chassis. The ZIS-6 was terrible, unreliable, underpowered, only produced in small numbers because the factories couldn't build them fast enough or well enough. Worse, it was unstable. The rocket launcher was top-heavy. The ZIS-6, with its narrow wheelbase and rear-wheel drive, would sometimes tip over during rapid maneuvers. The Studebaker US6 solved all of these problems. Its chassis was perfect. Wide wheelbase, strong frame, all-wheel drive for stability. It could handle the weight of the rocket launcher without issue. It was fast, not just faster than the ZIS-6, but fast enough to employ proper shoot-and-scoot tactics. Drive to a firing position, set up, launch all 16 rockets, and be gone. Already moving to a new location before German counter-battery fire could respond. This was the birth of the BM-13N. The N stood for Normalnaya, normal or standardized. The iconic weapon of the Red Army. Every propaganda photo, every newsreel, every Soviet war memorial shows this silhouette. Studebaker truck chassis, Katyusha rocket rails. It wasn't just a rocket launcher, it was a mobile rocket launcher. It could advance with the frontline units. It could saturate German positions, then vanish before retaliation. German soldiers who survived Katyusha barrages spoke of the psychological horror. Not just the explosions, but the certainty that you couldn't fight back. By the time you located where the barrage came from, the launcher was 5 kilometers away, hidden in a forest, already reloading. The Studebaker had become a weapons platform, For years before the war, Soviet military theorists had developed a doctrine called Glubokaya Operatsiya, deep operations or deep battle. The concept was brilliant in theory. Don't just break through enemy lines, penetrate deep into the enemy's rear, destroy command posts, cut supply lines, encircle entire armies before they can react. It required speed, mechanization, coordinated armor, infantry, artillery, and air power, moving as one unstoppable wave. The Soviets had the theory. They had the tanks. The T-34 was perfect for this kind of warfare. They had the tactical doctrine written out in manuals, but they didn't have the logistics. You can't conduct a deep battle with horses and broken-down trucks. The Studebaker was the missing piece. The logistics backbone that could actually support rapid, sustained offensive operations. By 1944, the Red Army was ready to prove it. June 22nd, 1944. 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa. The Germans were dug in along a massive defensive line in Byelorussia, modern Belarus. Army Group Center. Over 800,000 German soldiers, heavily fortified positions. They believed the terrain, dense forests, impassable swamps, made a major Soviet offensive impossible here. Soviet intelligence knew the Germans believed this, and they were about to exploit it. The Soviets assembled the largest offensive force in military history. 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, 31,000 artillery pieces. But the real key to Operation Bagration wasn't the tanks or the guns, it was the trucks, the deception. Maskirovka. The Soviets used their fleet of Studebakers to pull off one of the greatest deceptions in military history. At night, only at night, thousands of trucks moved supplies forward. Fuel, ammunition, food, bridging equipment, artillery shells. Everything needed for a massive offensive. The trucks drove with their lights off, engines muffled, strict radio silence. Movement was controlled down to the minute to avoid creating traffic jams that German reconnaissance might spot. Through the impassable swamps, along forest trails, across rivers on hastily built pontoon bridges that were dismantled before dawn. German intelligence noticed nothing. They were looking for signs of a buildup and seeing nothing. Meanwhile, Soviet trucks, some of them, visibly, were moving equipment away from the Byelorussian front toward Ukraine. The Germans assumed the main Soviet summer offensive would come in the south. They were catastrophically wrong. The attack. June 23, 1944. 5 a.m. The forest erupted. 31,000 Soviet guns opened fire simultaneously. The largest artillery barrage in human history. The sound was heard hundreds of kilometers away. German defensive positions simply ceased to exist. Bunkers collapsed. Communication lines were severed. Entire battalions were annihilated before the ground assault even began. Then came the tanks. Thousands of T-34s, supported by infantry riding on Studebaker trucks, smashed through the shattered German lines. German commanders tried to organize counterattacks, but they discovered something terrifying. The real victory, unstoppable logistics in 1941 during Barbarossa. German panzer divisions had advanced so quickly they outran their supply lines. They had to stop, wait for supplies to catch up. This gave Soviet forces time to regroup, counterattack, slow the advance. In 1944, the situation was reversed. Soviet T-34s broke through German lines and kept going. 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers. They didn't stop. Why not? Because following directly behind them, sometimes only a few kilometers back, was a river of steel. An endless conveyor belt of Studebaker trucks, fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, trucks carrying infantry who would dismount to mop up bypassed German positions, trucks carrying engineers to repair bridges, trucks carrying anti-aircraft guns to protect the advance from the Luftwaffe. The T-34s never ran out of fuel, never ran out of ammunition. The Soviet advance never slowed for logistical reasons. This was deep battle. The theory made real, and it was only possible because of those 400,000 American trucks. The result. In 2 months, Army Group Center was annihilated. Not defeated, not pushed back. Annihilated. 28 German divisions destroyed. 17 more divisions severely mauled. Over 400,000 German casualties. The single most devastating defeat the Wehrmacht suffered in the entire war. The Red Army advanced 450 miles, from Byelorussia to the outskirts of Warsaw. They liberated most of Soviet territory and pushed into Poland. It was Blitzkrieg in reverse, powered by American trucks. A German general, whose name was lost in the chaos of the retreat, but whose account was recorded by military historians, wrote, "We were not defeated by their tanks. We were not defeated by their numbers. We were defeated by their supplies. We were drowned in them." By the end of the war, the United States had shipped to the Soviet Union 427,000 trucks, the vast majority Studebakers, 50,000 jeeps, 375,000 tons of explosives, 4.5 million tons of food, 2.6 million tons of petroleum products, 15 million pairs of boots, 2,000 locomotives, 11,000 rail cars. And that's just a partial list. By late 1944, the Red Army had more trucks per soldier than the German Army. Let that sink in. The Horse Army of 1941, the army that had been stuck in the mud, starving, collapsing, was now the most motorized army in Europe. Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's greatest general, the man who commanded the defense of Moscow, the relief of Stalingrad, the drive to Berlin, wrote in his memoirs, "The Studebakers had exceptional cross-country ability. They played a huge role in the war. That's understated, even for Zhukov. But coming from a Soviet general in the post-war period, when mentioning American aid was politically dangerous, it's remarkable." Stalin himself, at the Tehran Conference in 1943, in a moment of unusual candor, said, "Without American machines, we would have lost this war." And in 1945, at a dinner celebrating victory, Stalin raised a toast to Roosevelt and Churchill. He said, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done to win this war. The most important things in this war are machines. The United States has proven it can turn out 8,000 to 10,000 aircraft per month. Russia can turn out, at most, 3,000 aircraft per month. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost this war. Those words were recorded, but after the war, they were rarely mentioned again. In 1945, the Soviet Union was victorious, but exhausted, devastated, 27 million dead, cities in ruins, industrial capacity crippled. And then the Iron Curtain fell. Stalin and his successors wanted to project strength. They wanted to tell a story. The glorious Soviet Union had defeated Nazi Germany alone. Soviet genius, Soviet heroism, Soviet industrial might. American aid was inconvenient to that narrative, so it was forgotten, deliberately erased. The Studebakers in propaganda photos were cropped out or painted over. War memorials showed T-34 tanks, but not the trucks that supplied them. History books minimized Lend-Lease or dismissed it as insignificant. Soldiers who mentioned American equipment were quietly discouraged. It became politically dangerous to talk about. The Katyusha rocket launcher became a pure Soviet weapon. The fact that most were mounted on American trucks was not mentioned. An entire generation of Soviet citizens grew up believing their country had won the Great Patriotic War entirely through its own efforts. The T-34 tank is the symbol of Soviet victory in World War II. It appears on monuments, stamps, museum displays. It deserves that recognition. It was an excellent tank. The Katyusha is the sound of that victory, the howling rockets that terrified German soldiers. It too deserves recognition. But the engine of that victory, the unglamorous, unstoppable, six-wheel drive workhorse that carried the Red Army from the desperate defense of Moscow to the capture of Berlin. That had "Made in South Bend, Indiana" stamped on its engine block. The Studebaker US6, the truck the Soviets called the Studa, the truck that arrived by the hundreds of thousands, the truck that stunned a Soviet commander because it could drive on mud, the truck that became a weapons platform for the most feared artillery piece on the Eastern Front, the truck that won the war. Wars are not won by bullets alone. They are won by logistics, by the ability to move supplies, move men, move firepower to where it's needed, when it's needed. The Soviet Union had the manpower, the courage, the determination, the willingness to sacrifice. America gave them mobility, and together they crushed the Third Reich.